Okay, this is, of course, biotensegrity and complexity. And topic for the day is going to be, let's talk about stretching. Actually, I never thought about stretching as a subject before until it came up during a biotensegrity tea party. So what we have to determine is stretching is a force. And what we're used to is this graphic depiction of the stress strain curve, which is a deformation of a structure and its response to forces. And so if you look into this, you have the stretch is your stress, usually considered a longitudinal stretch, and you get a corresponding change in the structure shape, which is deformation of a structure's response to forces. That's all this is stretching is. And normal linear matter stresses follow Hooke's law, positive Poisson's ratio, and Young's modulus, and this is the normal stress strain curve. That is the common one that is thought of by most engineers and biomechanics people. This is what they're looking at most of the time. Just to get everybody straight, Young's modulus is just the slope of the curve. It's a mathematical concept of the relationship of stress of strain is the slope of the curve. There are really two types of springs that we concern ourselves with. One is the linear spring, the normal spring that you're all used to. You pull one end and it goes up and down and follows this very nice sine curve. Everything goes up and down equally. And then you have the nonlinear spring, which is modeled with a spring and dashpot. A lot of people don't understand dashpots, and I don't blame them because it's an imperfect model. But it's like a plunger in a syringe where you pull on and you pull fast, and there's a resistance. It doesn't come as fast, and the resulting force is proportional to the velocity of your pull. What it is a damper that slows things down. The engineers use this combination of spring and dashpot to represent nonlinear stress strain curves, which isn't exactly right, but as close as they can get to it. But again, they're fudging, as engineers usually do. So you have the linear one that has Hooke's laws, a positive Poisson ratio, and a Young's modulus. And those are things like ceramics and stainless steel and typical metals. And their stress strain curve is essentially a straight line going up and down. But if you then look at things like bone and ligaments and biologic tissues, you end up with these modeled as spring and dashpot kind of model instead, which is nonlinear and has a different relationship. And that curve, instead of being straight like these, comes out wiggly and whatever shape happens to be at the moment. It's not a constant. Well, what we have to remember is tensegrities are really springs, and they're nonlinear springs, and therefore bone, muscle, tendon, fascia, collagen are all nonlinear springs. So when we're talking about stretching, you're talking about pulling or compressing a spring. I don't think we should make more stretching than that. So if you want to talk about stretching and get specific, what do you think is happening when stretching? You get the concept of you contract a muscle, and we'll talk mostly about muscles, and muscles contract and shortening. And when you lengthen them out, they relax. And so it's lengthening and shortening. A muscle is the usual concept of how a muscle moves back and forth and also works as a spring. And so you have the conventional wisdom of the muscle belly shortening and thickening. And you have to also think of what's going on at the other end. So what's happening at one end is supposed to be happening at the other. As conventionally, you think the muscle belly shortening, therefore it must be happening at the actin and myosin level where these things are going on. And this is the model that the bioengineers have come up with, which is the sliding filament model, which is the concept of what's going on at the microfilament level, where you're getting the actin-myosin sliding back and forth. Nobody's ever proven this. It really is a figment of the imagination of the engineers designing this stuff. And that's very clear. And Pollack talks about that in his books at least a couple of times. So why are bioengineers interpreting the micromechanics in the way they do? What are these guys really looking at? They're talking about paradigm determined research. That means what happened is they already know what the outcome is. That's their paradigm. They're trying to figure out how they got there. So all the research there is really defining and smoothing out the little things that don't quite fit into the answer that they already know they have. So if you start with a paradigm that says contraction is shortening of a muscle, and therefore that equals what's going on at the other end, which is the microfilament moving back and forth, you're stuck with this concept of shortening of muscle because one's feeding back and forth to the other. Okay, now, grab a hold of your glass of whatever it is and squeeze. And you'll squeeze and you'll see that there is no muscle shortening. You get an isometric expansion of your muscle. Your fingers aren't going anyplace. You're just tightening up your muscle and that muscle expands. So there really isn't any shortening of muscles. Muscles expand but do not shorten when you contract them. Okay. And here you go into, if you look at weightlifters or you try and lift something, you will see that the first thing you do is tighten your muscles. You expand your muscles. You don't contract muscles, you expand muscles. And again, that's contraction is a misnomer. It's exactly opposite of that. You're expanding it. So you're expanding these muscles and the muscles bulge before you even move anything. And you'll also note that all muscles are involved in every movement you have, because in order to blink your eyelash, you must have an equal and opposite force. If you're moving anything against an external force, you need an equal external force, and the only place you have that is where your foot hits the ground or your butt hits a chair. In space, you can't push a button unless you are pushing up against the wall of the spaceship to give a counter force. So all muscles have to get involved at any movement. I don't trust most muscle testing, but this is one of the muscle testing I believe because I happened to do it when I was in medical school. You string a fresh muscle on a spring frame at what is considered its resting length, and you test its strength by putting an electrical charge through it. And then you can either shorten the muscle or lengthen the muscle and test it again. And you find out that there's only a very narrow range, this grain range right in here, where you're getting the maximum force. As soon as you move one way or the other, you lose the power in the muscle, which means that changing muscle length is not an evolutionary option. You're decreasing efficiency, and the body would never do that. It would try and figure out some way of making that muscle work isometrically and isotonically so it doesn't have to keep going back and forth all the time, but certainly isometrically, because you don't want to change it, because if you shorten a muscle or lengthen a muscle, it's weaker. It's that simple. And of course, the way to keep a muscle isometric and isotonic is to set it up as part of a closed kinematic chain. So you set it up as a closed kinematic chain, all the elements in the closed kinematic chain remain isometric and isotonic. And you see that by looking at the structures that are tensegrities, or the model of Tom Fleming's arm, that everything, all the tension elements and all the compression elements remain isometric, same length, never changing length. So that gets us to Poisson's ratio. And so in conventional structures being regular engineering structures, you have positive Poisson's ratio, so that when you pull on the structure and stretch it, which is what you're doing, it gets longer and thinner. And that's Hooke's law. Hooke's law says that the volume remains a constant when you stress a structure and change its shape. But if you look at auxetic material, you pull on it and it stretches in both directions. It gets bigger. So the volume expands or contracts, which is non-Hookean, non-linear, non-Newtonian, negative Poisson's ratio. And Young's modulus doesn't apply because the curve is cockeyed and changing all the time. So there is no constant slope, so you can't use a Young's modulus. We know this is happening because there's now proof of it, because they've shown negative Poisson's ratio in tendons and skin and several tissues in different organisms. And here's studies done on different tendons in different animals, all showing a negative Poisson's ratio, meaning, again, we have nonlinear structures following different rules. So if you look at the muscle belly at one end, and then you look at the myosin actin at the other end, we're talking about where you end up is in the collagen, of course. So collagen then would have to fit into the same concept. And once you start talking collagen, we're talking connecting just about everything in the body is collagen. So the whole body is essentially nonlinear. Okay, let's get into another aspect of this, is phase transition or phase changes that occur in the body all the time. Now, in normal structures, in the gas, liquid, solid concepts of normal engineering, phase change is difficult. It takes a lot of time and energy going from solid to liquid to gas. I mean, it's a lot of work. In the solid gel relationships, it occurs at body temperature. So all these changes just keep changing rapidly at body temperature, and it can change from one phase to another. And the way to show you some phase change concept is think of water going from liquid to ice. Now, this is not soft matter, but the more standard physics. It takes a lot of heat and energy, or at least removal of heat, to go from water to ice. But that energy is enough to split rocks. On your right, this is actually a rock in my backyard. But this split wasn't caused by water. This was caused by the tree growing. And that rock was lying flat, horizontal. And as the tree grew, it raised it up in the air and was enough of a force to raise it up in the air and crack that rock. And the present distance of the top end split is 5 centimeters. And if I hang around long enough for another 50 years, it'll probably go to 10 centimeters and then eventually fall off. Now, this may have occurred over 20 years, but you have to appreciate that these events are occurring within your body within 20 milliseconds. So it's maybe a slow growth in the tree, but it's happening in your body constantly. And these forces are really big forces that are occurring at the micro level. So if we now think of a new paradigm, that we're taking into account auxetic material and closed kinematic chains, and looking at what's happening here and now saying, well, maybe that sliding mechanism was nonsense. Maybe there's something else going on there. And what's going on is more likely phase change. So the muscles expand without shortening or lengthening. They go from soft and compliant to hard and elastic by changing phase and expand at the same time. So if we go back and look at stretching, what else are we thinking about? So what is really happening? Well, I'll give you another thing that we don't think about often. Everybody grab a hold of your finger and give it a pull. Okay. Well, you will note that your finger gets longer. So you're stretching it and you get a space in the joint. That space occurs. This is my finger some 30 years ago when I first did it, maybe more, um, just to show that space. And that space exists. So stretching actually opens up a joint space. So it does do something. And this is different than stretching muscle and fascia. There's a concept of John Manel's, who was one of my mentors, probably number one mentor, and taught me about joint play. That there's an active range of your finger or any joint, so you can move your joints and fingers and you have that active range. But there's also a passive range at each end of play movement, where that space has to be free enough to move and give and allow that active range. And if it doesn't do that, you get a barrier that's restrictive, but you may be able to loosen it by doing things like warming up and stretching and manipulation and massage, heat, whatever you want to do, something loosens it up. But clearly stretching does this. That joint play is ubiquitous. If there is movement any place, there has to be play movement as part of it, because you can't make a perfectly matched bolt and a perfectly matched nut so that they're exactly the same diameter. You have to have a play movement between them. So if there is movement, there has to be play movement as part of it, and that goes up and down the scale. Let's get to one more thing that's part of this picture, and that's thixotropic. And that's, you are all familiar with thickening things like ketchup, or so that's thick in the bottle, and then you give it a squeeze, applying a force, a squeezing force to the bottle that then makes that thick gel more liquid-like, salt-like. And you know that you have this bowl of yogurt, you stick the fruit on, and if you stir that bowl, the fruit will loosen up and sink down. So you have a gel mixture here, and then you put some sort of stress into the system and you can shake it and do something, and then it turns to a sol. Fruit may sink to the bottom and the whole mixture might flow and the surface become flat and smooth rather than irregular and lumpy. Remove the stress and let it stand, and it will change back into a gel. So what if our body structures behave this way? Here is a super slow motion video of a man being hit in the face with a volleyball. You know, what's going on there? Is he stretching like a linear spring? Or is it non-linear, auxetic, phase change, thixotropic, soft matter responding to stresses? Now that we have a new paradigm to work with, the answer seems pretty obvious. Well, what is stretching? We're back with the simple spring concept. Is it that? Well, it's not. We know it's a more complicated system. The answer really is nonlinear, auxetic, closed kinematic chains, isometric, isotonic, joint play, thixotropy, phase change, complexity. I mean, it's a mixture of things. With a change in paradigm, the original question may lose meaning, and a plethora of new possibilities may present themselves. And where would young people be without the sage advice of their elders? Now it's time for questions.